Maturing beyond the sinfulness of negligence, shame, and malice. Sin equals any error, not just moral violations, or any act of misconduct, including even a failure to take responsible action. That's how I'm using the word sin. And these three types of sin that I'm about to list, or that I already listed and will list again, are in the tradition of the ancient Hebrews. They had three different words, all of which are translated into English typically as sin. And those words could also be translated into the following subcategories or types of sin: negligence, shame, and malice. And then there's also the various, actions. And on the blog, you can see there a famous English translation from the New Testament with a picture of a nail and a hammer. That's a reference to the nailing of a living human to a cross to execute the criminal or heretic in that case. And the passage, the words say, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." Now back to the text of what I wrote. You are soul. Soul is attention. Attention is the source of words. Words are your creation, not your source. Words are the creation of attention, not the source of attention. Words can direct the attention of the young and impressionable, like hypnotically, but when the soul matures, attention is stabilized beyond words. That's sometimes in Eastern tradition called things like awakening or enlightenment. It is an error to believe in words. Belief in words is the root of all malice or ill will. In particular, people may identify themselves with or against certain words. That is the root of all psychological suffering: guilt, anxiety, depression, etc. And in the Buddhist tradition, there would be a phrase like this: aversion and craving. Those are the not just attraction or towards something and repulsion, but actual craving and aversion. Those are states of suffering rather than just states of, well, this appeals to me and that doesn't. So the misidentification with linguistic labels is also the root of idolatry, which involves mistaking a word like sacred or holy with divinity itself. When one is ignorant of divinity, by which I mean, incidentally, attention, when one is ignorant of one's identity as attention or divinity, and then labels as holy some mere word or phrase or idea or physical object or pattern, that is idolatry. I'm not condemning it, I'm just saying that's what it is. That's what I mean by idolatry. I'm not condemning hypocrisy, I'm not condemning condemnation, I'm just, sorting out these different distinctions in language, these different labels, these different patterns of behavior and thought and so on. So the word divinity is not what is symbolized by the word divinity. The sound divinity, those aren't sacred, holy sounds in the same way that divinity itself is truly holy. And what's meant by holy? The word holy isn't holy, it's just the word holy. But the word points to attention. Divinity points to attention. Attention points to attention. Holy points to attention. To make attention into a holy word is also an error. You are attention, and you know this, and no words are required. That's important to note. No words are required for you to be attention. You already are. So worshiping the word divinity, or even a particular scripture, including the U.S. Constitution, which many people worship like it's a scripture, is idolatry. So sin includes ignorance, negligence, shame, and malice, as well as the resulting actions. While some uses of the word sin refer in particular to actions, that usage diverges from the traditional Jewish, Hebrew, or Greek usages, as well as diverging from the words of the most famous religious figures such as Jesus, Buddha, and Isaiah. Sin is not just a category of action, but also the source of some behavioral reaction. That's really the issue, is that the action is this reaction to some, let's say, context that's or interpretation that happens in language. So consider this translation of a famous heretical prophet. You have been told that to put someone to death is sin, but I say to you that even to be angry or hold ill will toward another is sin, even to condemn them, as well as other famous instructions from that same famous heretic. Condemn not, judge not. Let the one among you without sin cast the first stone. Don't try and remove the speck from another's eye until you remove the log from your own. And of course, forgive one another. Forgive 70 times, 7 times. It's a ridiculous statement relative to what's normal for a child or even for a young adult in most any culture in the world. To forgive with that degree of mercy or graciousness or dignity, that's really unusual from a human perspective. So, ill will, as distinct from just violence, but actual ill will, whether there's any violent activity or not, ill will requires language. Resentment does not arise from the original action or inaction that the resentment is a reaction to, because it's not just a reaction to that action or inaction. Resentment is actually a reaction to the language that we can use to ongoingly produce an experience newly out of our commentary and imagination relating to a memory. So something happens, we make it into a memory, we have some imagination and some commentary and interpretation about that memory, and eventually we can produce resentment, and then out of that we may react to that resentment in our various behaviors. But the behaviors, the symptoms, aren't the issue. For instance, Jesus was never especially concerned with the behaviors. You may know this. There was some spirit or way of being to which someone like Jesus might have been attentive, rather than so much to the resulting behaviors. So resentment requires first creating shame from a past incident, and then blaming someone else for our experience that we allegedly should not have had, while we mature in the capacity to accept the experience. In other words, our challenging experiences are part of our development, our spiritual development, our personal development, whatever you want to call it. The cultivating of antagonism through language is the root issue of all sinful behavior. From antagonism, many actions may arise, often reflexively, such as war, murder, rape, theft, fraud, and so on. We have a sense of being possessed by the spirit of the devil, or the spirit of, what we call it, passion of rage or something. And we have lots of rationalizations, typically. However, as Jesus said, it does not require the action of a murder or rape for antagonism or jealous lust to be a disturbance to one's well-being. The issue is the disturbance, not just the behavior that may result from the disturbance. So, What is this so-called disturbance? Well, it's actually a disturbance in language, through language. So just to review the sequence of development. First, we are totally ignorant. We don't even have language initially. Then we begin to learn, but still are developing discipline, and thus we're subject to negligence, which means just not being attentive to the predictable consequences of our behavior. We don't know yet what we're learning to predict the consequences of our behavior. So initially, to be called negligent is even a little bit odd. We're ignorant, and then as time goes on, we can be more or less attentive or negligent. So that negligence can be viewed as a failure to be responsible for our reputation, and that's the connection with shame, our identity, our ego, our pride. So next, after that stage of ignorance and then some learning, we then construct linguistic rationales to blame others for our results. That is, the results of our own behavior, which is malice or ill will or resentment. Those are the linguistic rationales for blame, are malice, ill will, resentment, but also shame and pride. We create pride as a barrier to accepting responsibility for our overall results by focusing on some particular results that we're proud of while we ignore the rest of our results, or some in particular at least, of which we may be quite ashamed and even quite hysterical if anyone attempts to direct attention to those results for which we may have been constructing a linguistic identifying or labeling as shameful. In other words, this should not have happened. Certainly should not have happened to me, to us. In fact, shouldn't have happened at all. That kind of thing. Well, if we have that, and then someone points to this thing that should not have happened, that can result in kind of a reflective reaction against that, right? It's kind of understandable, wouldn't you think? Wouldn't you say? So, in other words, on the foundation of shame, we may develop malice towards those who fail to agree with us about our prides and our shames. We may want to withdraw from them. We may feel resentment and even hatred and so forth towards them. So that experience of malice or ill will might be called hell or purgatory, especially if there's guilt and shame underneath it, right? Trying to earn one's way into heaven. That sounds a lot like hell or purgatory. So there may be access to heaven at a later stage, but at that stage, it's not clear to the perceiver, to the attention, what heaven would mean. People can describe it as a state of peace, compassion towards all beings, innocence, mercy, even relaxation. There's a lot of terms people can use. Humble like a child, curious, open. But experiencing it is a different thing than having a few words to describe it. At some point, the use of the word heaven becomes somewhat irrelevant, just as the use of the word open or humble may be irrelevant. So these are the three basic stages of human socio-linguistic development. In other words, language is core to our social development. So here are the three basic stages of our development of our social sophistication and our linguistic sophistication and maturing. First, ignorance, then shame, and then malice towards those people who we blame for our shame. So next, however, after those three is maturity. Or we could call it other things, but how about maturity, awakening, enlightenment, whatever. A comprehension of the role of language in the constructing of shame and malice. Allow for an attention to that linguistic process, whether it's going on in oneself or in one's midst. And the realization then can arise that inattentiveness or negligent language itself is what creates the malice. We have to have a rationale. We have to have a blaming, a rationalizing in order to have ill will or malice. So the only remedy required to interrupt, so to speak, is to cease the negligent language. We don't even have to interrupt it. We stop doing it. We're the ones who create it. We create that language and the resulting experience of resentment and malice. So cease from the practice of that negligent language and remain attentive. Sin no more. And that is freedom from sin. That is spiritual rebirth. Now, certainly, everything that you may have just heard here may have some degree of familiarity with other teachings and may have some degree of distinction or novelty or newness relative to things you might have heard before. So, now that you may have learned that sinfulness is something that one can mature beyond, and one may also have learned now to be clear about the different kinds of sinfulness, the stages, the ignorance, negligence, shame, and then malice or ill will. Once one's clear about how those things fit together, that they fit within God's design, they're not outside of God's will. That's just the way that it works, it being life. Well, then here we are. We have this opportunity to develop and mature and be clear about these words like sin, awakening, divinity, and so on. These are just words. But they are useful and functional.